Sauron may have been the big bad in The Lord of the Rings, but he seemed mostly passive. After all, the Dark Lord never left his tower in Mordor to enter the field. Nope, he had armies of orcs and Saruman do it for him. This makes sense, since he was mostly a spectral form at this point, physically manifesting as a red eye in Mordor. The ring, too, held a part of Sauron's soul, probably where the idea of Horcruxes was born, and thus was trying to get back to its master. Does that mean the One Ring is the true big bad? Let us know in the comments. Until then, hear about Dark Lord Sauron, if you will. He was one of many forms, both fair and foul, his terror spreading across ages. This was especially true after he forged the Rings of Power, which ensured he would rule everyone if undefeated, and if defeated, would continue to exist. Sauron wasn't how this Dark Lord started out. After all, he was one of the Maia, just like Gandalf. Like Saruman, he was a disciple of Aule, or Mahal, as the Dwaro called the god, and his downfall was tragic, for it was the classic case of the road to hell being paved with good intentions and destroyed by impatience. Let's start by looking at Sauron's OG form. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Myron. Aule is like the Hephaestus of Arda, aka a smith god, and his disciple Myron learned all about the forge from it. Good and trustworthy as Eru had made him, Myron loved order and despised chaos. Yet this proved to be his undoing. He saw in the dark Melkor, someone who had the will to reshape the world. Myron wanted to dominate the minds of Middle-earth for what he perceived as their own benefit. To this end, he joined up and became Melkor's chief assistant, the Vader, if you will. No wonder the fandom seems to love Sauron, or perhaps that has more to do with his appearance in the Rings of Power as Anatar. We'll look at that later, but for now, let's look what Myron was like in the service of Melkor. Sauron, the servant of Melkor. Where Myron looked beautiful enough to deceive the Valar into thinking he was on their side, Sauron, as the elves named the servant of Melkor, looked like a dark abomination, if his name is to be believed. Just like Myron, Sauron too had all the powers of a Maia, which can often be forgotten when writers write fanfiction about him and Melkor. The origins of those stories lie in how Sauron tricked the Valar numerous times for Melkor, helped him create the orcs, and when Melkor was captured, evaded capture himself while keeping the dark operations going on Middle-earth for Melkor to reign over when he returned. Such loyalty, much wow. When Melkor did return, there were other wars to be fought. For example, once Melkor stole Feanor's Silmarillion, the elves would come to Middle-earth to rain vengeance. In that battle, Sauron would gain notoriety as one of the worst of Melkor's named servants, a title he would soon share with many other titles and forms. For example, when Melkor went to wage wars with the newly awakened race of men on Middle-earth, Sauron took up the mantle against the elves, which required him to turn into Werewolf Sauron, known simply as the Wolf. This was a dark form Sauron took. After all, experts say he couldn't turn fair and beautiful again, but could still shapeshift, despite his visage of Anatar in the Second Age. But all agree that Sauron could still shapeshift. Here, he'd taken over the elvish island of Tol Sirion and turned it into Tol in Gauroth, aka the Isle of Werewolves. During this reign, he had a vampire and the sire of all werewolves as his aide, which seemed to work well until Beren and Luthien entered the picture. Yeah, the first cross-racial couple in Middle-earth, who we've looked at in our love across the videos of the race, had a run-in with Sauron himself. What happened in as such? Beren was captured by Sauron when trying to travel through the captured isle, disguised as an orc. While he languished in the dungeons after his companion Finrod had died to save him from a werewolf Sauron sent to attack them and get information out of them, who should arrive to rescue the hero on the quest for the Silmarillion but the elven princess Luthien herself. At her side stood Huan, the wolfhound of the Valar. Such was the power of Huan that it not only defeated all of Sauron's servants, but when the Dark Lord transformed himself into a werewolf and went toe-to-toe with Huan, he too tasted bitter defeat. This resulted in him escaping the isle he'd captured, disguised as a vampire, which of course became Sauron's next form. Sauron's vampire guise. If you think when Huan let Sauron go it was a mistake, leave a comment. Yes, that's right. The wolfhound of the Valar let Sauron go. Guised as an intelligent bat, Sauron flew away, dripping blood. After this, the future Dark Lord would go into hiding. Fans theorize this is because he was scared of Melkor's wrath at his defeat at the hands of Huan. Yet, as we fans know, Sauron wasn't gone forever. No, he would resurface after his master was defeated and carried away in chains. Then he would plead for mercy in front of the victories, the host host of the West. Another mistake made by the good guys, eh? They should have known the Maia was a turncoat when he refused. Out of pride, mind you, to return to the utter West and face judgment from the Valar. Instead, he fled and hid somewhere in Middle-earth, which seems to be his MO. After all, wasn't he hiding in the Mirkwood fortress Dol Guldur during the quest for Erebor in The Hobbit? The movies made it an entire subplot, drawing from other canon sources, giving us Galadriel at the height of her ring's power driving Sauron out of there. But that's us getting ahead of ourselves, because when we reach The Hobbit, we have Sauron's defeat in the Second Age. Yes, we're entering the Rings of Power timeline. Which was the form Sauron took after he was done being a bat, you ask? Well, fans, next we see him as a serpent. Tolkien uses serpents for both dragons and normal snakes. The form that Sauron took on as a serpent during his fight with the Valar's Wolfhound was also called a serpent. This form was donned by Sauron before Melkor, or Morgoth, was defeated in the first battle between the host of the West and the Dark Valar. Now buckle up, because we're about to enter the Second Age of Middle-earth when, with Melkor out of the picture, Sauron begins to form plans to take over. Sure, some fans say that's in preparation for his master's return, but now we have Sauron playing the game, as we saw him do in the Rings of Power show, albeit differently. Yes, it's finally time to look at Anatar, the giver of gifts. Now, this is a long tale, but we'll try to keep it short. To begin with, Sauron in the Second Age grew more powerful than Morgoth ever was and took on titles such as Lord of the Earth and King of Men. After having fled, he hid for 5 centuries and then reappeared in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. Here, he began constructing his dreaded tower, Barad-dûr, and gathered armies of the servants of Morgoth such as the Orcs, and also began corrupting the race of men, especially those that were native to Middle-earth, such as the Easterlings. Yet, Sauron wanted the elves and their power under his command, and thus he donned the fair look of Anatar, or the giver of gifts, pretending, according to some sources such as the Unfinished Tales, to be an agent of the Valar waiting for the Maia to reach Middle-earth. In this form, he befriended the greatest elven smiths of the time, including Celebrimbor. According to a few sources, he even got the elves of Gwaith Ymir Dain under his sway, leading Galadriel and Celeborn to leave the area. To these elves, he imparted the gift of the knowledge on how to forge the Rings of Power, but secretly infused them with spells to make them subservient to the One Ring that he forged in secrecy. When he put it on, however, the elves became aware of his plans, and unlike the 9 mortal kings who fell under Sauron's spells and became Nazgûl, the 3 elven lords under the sky hid their rings, thus saving Middle-earth. The Dwaro kings had 9 rings too, but Sauron couldn't use them to his ends, as beyond infecting them with an insatiable gold lust, Sauron's rings couldn't do much to the children of Mahal. Of course, in their history, this gold lust brought tremendous pain, but for Sauron's purposes, the Dwaro proved immune to his moves. What happened next, you ask? Let's see. Sauron essentially became the master of all of Middle-earth except for the elven king Gil-galad's people. These were the accursed years where Sauron gained the title Dark Lord, until the descendants of Beren and Luthien intervened. Yeah, Elrond's brothers' descendants, the Númenor kings, beat Sauron. Defeated Sauron went back to Mordor to lick his wounds and plan his revenge. As the Second Age drew to a close, Sauron once again rose to power and called himself the King of Men, and this led to Sauron's armored form. This angered the reigning ruler of Númenor, Ar-Pharazôn, who came to Middle-earth and demanded Sauron bend the knee. Yeah, like Jon Snow. Now, see? Sauron was smart. He took one look at the army at his doors and decided, nope, can't beat that, fair and square. Time to retort to trickery and the long game. So, donning a fair visage, he tried to flatter the king and pretended to be reluctant when the king took him hostage. Step 1, check. Now he could influence the working of the court from within. He manipulated the king's court, using their fear of mortality and the gift of Eru, and ensured that most of them became worshippers of Morgoth. He even incited the king to attack Valinor. Yet, this is where his plans went topsy-turvy, for Eru himself intervened, drowning the island of Númenor and shaping the world so that only 11 ships could reach Valinor. So technically, men can reside in Valinor, can Dwaro. Or are Legolas and Gimli aimless sailing into the sunset forever? Back to Sauron, though. Once the people of Númenor were dealt with, either as trapped in debris by Eru at the shores of Valinor or drowned, Sauron once again fled to Middle-earth, only to get news that set his temper ablaze. A group of the surviving Númenorian people who had stayed faithful to the Valar were being led by Elendil, a man Sauron failed to turn to Morgoth worship, and they'd established 2 kingdoms in exile, Gondor and Arnor, right at Sauron's doorstep. Wait, if Gondor is a kingdom in exile, like Thorin's Blue Mountains kingdom, then isn't Aragorn still a king in exile at the end of the Return of the King? But with Númenor gone, I suppose. Well, let's stick to Sauron's tales of defeat. For now, it's time for the combined host of men and elves to once again drive the point home that Sauron cannot win. First it was Huan, then it was the host of the West, then Numenor, and now the last alliance. See, Sauron was still weak from his defeat at the hands of Eru. Gil-galad, though, had become stronger while Sauron was working in Numenor. So naturally, he and Elendil teamed up, and the last alliance of men and elves marched on Mordor. Gil-galad and Elendil sacrificed their lives to destroy Sauron's physical body, but the One Ring remained, which is when Isildur comes in, and our favorite sword, Narsil. Using the unbroken version of the sword that was broken, Isildur cut the One Ring from Sauron's finger and defeated him. Sauron didn't die, as we know, since Isildur couldn't throw the ring into the fires of Mount Doom. And this is where we enter the events that would lead to the Hobbit.
From out of the darkness, a necromancer has come.
Necromancer. Since the One Ring remained and Sauron had poured most of his power and will into it, Sauron remained as a shadow. Then he resurfaced in TA 1000 in the fortress of Dol Guldur in Mirkwood. This was him as the Necromancer. Around this time, the Maia were also sent to Middle-earth, and while Sauron dismissed them as mere efforts by defeated imperialists, Gandalf became his most hated enemy. Though, of course, Sauron was right about Saruman, as fans of Lord of the Rings know. During this time, the Nazgûl too returned and annihilated the kingdoms of Arnor and greatly reduced the power of Gondor. While the kings went into exile and became the Rangers, other evil things became calamities, such as Smaug, who attacked Dale and Erebor. Suspecting Sauron's return, Gandalf decided to investigate Dol Guldur in TA 2063. While in the movies, Sauron was driven out of Mordor, in the original canon, Sauron fled Dol Guldur during Gandalf's poking around to conceal his identity. This started the time period known as the Watchful Peace. The Dark Lord returned in TA 2460, the same when Smeagol got his hands on the One Ring, which would eventually drive him to become Gollum. Around the same time, with the Dwaro being driven out of Moria, Sauron began to populate it with his dark folk. Eventually, we'd reach the events of The Hobbit, where Gandalf feared that Sauron would ally with Smaug and use the dragon to attack Rivendell and Lothlorien to re-establish the foul kingdom of Angmar. Hence, he convinced Thorin Oakenshield to take his company of brave Dwaro and one hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, to retake Erebor. In this quest, Bilbo defeated Gollum in a battle of riddles, and without knowing it, became the master of the One Ring, which meant that he couldn't manipulate him to return to Sauron. Once Bilbo had to bequeath the ring to his heir, Frodo, we reached the events of The Lord of the Rings. Around the same time, Sauron had returned to Mirkwood and was driven out of it by the White Council, aka the Council of the Wizards and ruling elves in Middle-earth, which led to him gaining the fractions of his strength he had without the One Ring, and establishing himself once again in Mordor, first in secret and then openly.
It's him. The Eye.
Eye of Sauron. While it's unknown when the Eye of Sauron was formed, it's known that few could endure its terrible gaze. The Eye was established in the land of Mordor by Sauron in the movies and books and used as a banner, while it was more tangible in the movies. In the books, this symbol of Sauron's semi-omnipresence was pasted on all his banners and seen once when the clouds parted over Mordor. The purpose of the Eye? To track the movements of Frodo Baggins, the bearer of the One Ring. Of course, as we know, Frodo and Sam, with the help of the distraction offered by Aragorn and his allies' armies at the Black Gate, managed to evade the Eye. Gollum doomed the ring to the fires of Mount Doom, ending Sauron for good, aka reducing him to a shadow form. Sauron was reduced to a great shadow once the One Ring was destroyed. This was blown away by a great gust of wind, and thus the Dark Lord that once terrorized Middle-earth ended up as a shapeless malice that fed on itself. Like teacher, like student. So, are these all the forms of Sauron, the dreaded? Well, from a certain point of view, but the Rings of Power did touch on another form. Halbrand. Fans have called this a non-canon change made by the show. While in the books we see Anatar, or the Lord of the Gifts, Sauron, who manipulates the elves, in the show we see him as Halbrand. And boy, does Galadriel play an important part in his story. First of all, she swears to find him when she discovers his sigil in the dead body of Finrod, who is her brother, so far close to canon. Then she realized this sigil was a stylized map of the Southlands, thus realizing that Sauron intended to make that his stronghold. And so he was trying as Halbrand, sometime after Adar, or the Lord Father of the Orcs, had struck him, seeing how cruel Sauron was to the creatures he'd created. Sauron, then, posing as a man fleeing Orc raids and attacks, carried on himself the insignia of the King of the Southlands, which he claimed to have taken from a dead man, which fans assume was the actual King of the Southlands, perhaps even killed at Sauron's hands. Eventually, Sauron comes upon a raft in the Sundering Seas, where he meets Galadriel, and after some adventures, the two reach Numenor. Here, after some shenanigans, Galadriel is convinced that Sauron is the rightful King of the Southlands, and has secured passage for both him him and her to Middle-earth with a Numenor expedition. They then defeat Adar, whom Sauron would have killed, but Galadriel captures instead. Then, soon after Sauron's introduced as the rightful King Halbrand, he's injured and thus is taken by Galadriel for elven healing. This results in him meeting Celebrimbor and starting the forging of the Three Rings. Of course, Galadriel discovers his true identity and he's forced to flee. But the forging of the rings continues, and we all know how that ends. So fans, there you have it. Some highlights of Sauron's lifetime. What do you think? Were his dark and evil plans better or worse than Vader or Voldemort? Let us know while we present A Marvelous Verdict. Professor Tolkien is the father of modern fantasy literature, which would mean one can rationally assume that Sauron inspired quite a few Dark Lords. With his numerous forms, Sauron seems like an opportunistic evil, which is resilient like a pest, despite his numerous defeats. Yet it seems victory is forever out of the grasp of this Lord of the Gifts and Wolves and many others. Perhaps that's because evil should never be allowed to gain a strong foot in the world, and the Professor wanted to tell that story. What do you think? And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.